Hello and welcome to the Street Crime USA YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share, comment and subscribe. Born in 1905, Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was a notorious gangster and crime boss who operated in Harlem, New York during the 20th century. Known as the Harlem Godfather, Bumpy was a prominent figure in the city's underworld, with a reputation for being both feared and respected. Bumpy grew up in poverty and turned to a life of crime at a young age, eventually rising to power as a leader of a gang in Harlem. He was known for his strategic mind and his ability to navigate the complex web of relationships and rivalries which existed in the Harlem criminal underworld. He was known for being a notorious and fearsome crime boss. Mr. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson had ruled with an iron grip the Harlem neighborhood of New York City and had rose to power in the mid-20th century. For more than 30 years, Bumpy Johnson was famous for being one of New York City's most revered and feared crime bosses of Harlem. His wife said she and everyone in the local area had called him the Harlem Godfather, and it was for good reason. Known for ruling Harlem with an iron fist, he had dealt with anyone who dared to challenge him with a brutal and vicious fashion. Run rival named Ulysses Rollins had unfortunately caught the business end of Mr. Johnson's switchblade, a staggering 36 times in a single fight. During another confrontation, Mr. Johnson had again seen Mr. Rollins in a dinner club and pounced on him with his blade. By the time Mr. Johnson was done with him, it was reported that Mr. Rollins' eyeball was left dangling from its socket. After the brutal attack, Mr. Johnson had then proclaimed that he now had a sudden craving for spaghetti and meatballs. However, as ruthless and as brutal that he could be, Mr. Johnson was also very well known for being a gentleman, who was also willing to take time out to help those who were less fortunate members of his community. In addition to his charitable acts, Mr. Johnson had garnered a considerable reputation as a very fashionable man about the town, who always rubbed elbows with celebrities like Billie Holiday and Sugar Ray Robinson. Whether it was celebrities and even historical luminaries like Malcolm X or everyday Harlemites, Bumpy Johnson was beloved by his community, perhaps even more than he was feared by them. Upon his return to New York City in 1963, after serving time in the notorious Alcatraz prison, Mr. Johnson was met with an impromptu parade. The whole neighborhood had wanted to get together to welcome the Harlem Godfather back home. Ellsworth Raymond Bumpy Johnson was born in Charleston, South Carolina on October 31st, 1905 to Margaret Moultrie and William Johnson. Due to a slight deformation of his skull, he was given the nickname Bumpy at a young age, and from then on it stuck. When Bumpy was 10, his older brother Willie was accused of killing a white man from the local community in which they lived. Afraid of a possible lynch mob on the family, his parents had decided to remortgage their tiny home to try and raise enough money to move most of their 7 children to Harlem, which at the time was kind of a safe haven for the black community in the early 20th century. Once there, a young Mr. Johnson was told he would have to move in with his older sister. Because of his bumpy head, thick southern accent and short stature, Mr. Johnson was picked on by the other local children. But many theorize that this may be how Mr. Johnson's skills for a life of crime had first developed. Instead of taking the beatings and taunts from others, a young Mr. Johnson had made a name for himself as a very able and willing fighter, who others began to realize was not someone who should be messed about with. Bumpy soon dropped out of high school and now decided it was time to start creating an income of his own. He started making money by pool hustling, selling newspapers and sweeping the storefronts of restaurants. He did a very good job and was offered more work around the neighborhood. His workload became so busy that he was even able to provide work for his gang of friends. This is how Bumpy had met William Bub Hewlett, a notorious local gangster who took a liking to Mr. Johnson when he refused to back off Bub's storefront territory. Bub, who saw a young Mr. Johnson's potential and appreciated his boldness, had invited him into the business of offering physical protection to the high-profile number bankers in Harlem, a very lucrative and very well-respected job in enforcement in the criminal community. And before long, after collecting many debts and keeping bankers safe from potential robberies and muggers, Mr. Johnson became known as one of the most sought after, loyal, trustworthy and ruthless bodyguards in the neighborhood. Now that he had gained a considerable reputation from his peers within the criminal community, Bumpy Johnson's criminal career itself soon flourished, as he had now graduated to planning and executing brutal armed robberies, as well as extorting local gangsters and businesses, and pimping the women of his community. Bumpy was a young man who had it all. It was his first time at experiencing such power and money at such a scale. Because of this, Bumpy had inevitably made mistakes on his path to understanding the game. This meant, like many before and after, he wasn't able to avoid being caught and thus received many punishments. Mr. Johnson was in and out of reform schools and prison for much of his 20s. After serving 2.5 years on a grand larceny charge, Bumpy Johnson had got out of prison in 1932 in great health and physical condition, but with no money or occupation to support himself in the unforgiving streets of Harlem. But once he was back on the streets of his local neighborhood, people began to talk about his return, and his name, as well as his reputation as being a loyal but fierce individual, had reached the ears of all the gangsters who now controlled the streets of Harlem. Eventually, Bumpy was asked if he would accept an invitation to meet with Miss Stephanie St. Clair. At the time, Miss St. Clair was the reigning queen of several notoriously very effective criminal organizations, which was spread across Harlem. Miss St. Clair was the leader of a ruthless gang called the 40 Thieves, and was also a key investor in a number of lucrative betting and numbers rackets in the neighborhood. Miss St. Clair had taken a liking to Mr. Johnson's mannerisms, and was impressed with how he had dealt with previous situations that had occurred within the Harlem criminal underworld. She was certain that Bumpy Johnson would be her perfect partner in crime. Miss St. Clair had made a very wise choice. She was amazed by Mr. Johnson's intelligence, and the two quickly became very good friends. This was despite their 20-year age difference, though some biographers peg her as being only 10 years his senior. Over time, Mr. Johnson became Miss St. Clair's personal bodyguard, as well as her numbers runner and bookmaker, whilst Miss St. Clair evaded the Mafia and waged war against the notorious German-Jewish mobster Dutch Schultz. But at the time, 26-year-old Mr. Johnson committed a series of crimes, including murder, at her request. As Mr. Johnson's wife, Mamie, who married him in 1948, wrote in her biography of her life with the crime boss that Bumpy and his crew of 9 had waged a guerrilla war of sorts, and picking off Dutch Schultz's men was easy since there were few other white men who were walking around Harlem during the day. By the end of the war, 40 people had been kidnapped or killed for their involvement. But the war did not end because of Mr. Johnson and his men. Instead, Mr. Schultz was ultimately killed by orders from Lucky Luciano, the infamous head of the Italian Mafia in New York. This resulted in Mr. Johnson and Mr. Luciano making a deal. The Harlem bookmakers could retain their independence from the Italian mob as long as they agreed to pass along a cut of their profits. As Mamie Johnson wrote, it wasn't a perfect solution and not everyone was happy, but at the same time, the people of Harlem realised that Bumpy had ended the war with no further losses and had negotiated a peace with honour, and they realised that for the first time, a black man had stood up to the white mob instead of just bowing down and going along to get along. After this meeting, Mr. Johnson and Mr. Luciano met on a regular basis to play chess, sometimes at Mr. Luciano's favourite spot in front of the YMCA on 135th Street. But the war had took its toll on Miss St. Clair, who now decided to go her own way, steering clear of criminal activity after serving time for shooting her con man of a husband. However, Miss St. Clair is said to have maintained the protection of Mr. Johnson until his death. With Miss St. Clair out the game, it was clear Bumpy Johnson was now the one and only true godfather of Harlem. With Bumpy Johnson as the godfather of Harlem, anything that happened in the criminal underworld of the neighbourhood had to get his seal of approval first before it happened. As Mamie Johnson wrote, if you wanted to do anything in Harlem, and I mean anything at all, you better stop and see Bumpy first, because he ran the place. You want to open a spot on the avenue? Go and see Bumpy. Thinking of converting your brownstone into a speakeasy? Check with Bumpy first. And if anyone didn't come to see Bumpy first, they paid the price. But perhaps few paid the price as dearly as one of Mr. Johnson's rivals, Ulysses Rollins, did. As one chilling extract from Miss Johnson's biography reads, Bumpy had spotted Mr. Rollins. He pulled out a knife and jumped on Mr. Rollins, and the two men rolled on the floor for a few moments before Bumpy stood up and straightened his tie. Mr. Rollins remained on the floor, his face and his body badly gashed, and one of his eyeballs hanging from the socket by ligaments. Bumpy calmly stepped over the man, picking up the menu, and said he suddenly had a taste for spaghetti and meatballs. However, as merciless as he was known to be with anyone who opposed him, Mr. Johnson was also known to have a soft side. Some even compared him to the late great Robin Hood because of the way he used his money and power to help the impoverished communities of his neighborhood. He had delivered gifts and meals to his neighbors in Harlem, and even supplied turkey dinners on Thanksgiving, and hosted a Christmas party every year for the local residents to enjoy. As his wife noted, he was known to lecture the younger generations about studying academics instead of crime, although he always maintained a sense of humor about his brushes with the law. Mr. Johnson was also a very fashionable man of the Harlem Renaissance. Known for his love of poetry, he got some of his poems published in the Harlem magazine. Being the head of a criminal organization meant Bumpy attracted a lot of female attention. It was reported that he had affairs with many New York celebrities, such as the editor of the Vanity Fair, Helen Lawrenson, and the singer and actress, Lena Horne. He wasn't a typical gangster, wrote Frank Lucas, a notorious drug trafficker who came up under the wing of Bumpy in Harlem in the 1960s and 70s. He worked in the streets, but he wasn't of the street. He was refined and classy, more like a businessman with a legitimate career than most people in the underworld. I could tell by looking at him that he was a lot different from the people I saw in the street. No matter how smoothly Mr. Johnson ran his crime business, he was never immune to the long arms of the law and had spent a fair share of time in prison. In 1951, Mr. Johnson received his longest prison sentence, a 15-year term for selling heroin in and around the streets of Harlem, a crime and sentence that eventually saw him sent to Alcatraz, arguably one of the most dangerous prisons in the country. In 1952, Mr. Johnson's activities were reported in the Celebrity People section of Jet. The magazine told of Mr. Johnson's criminal exploits, his flamboyant lifestyle, and how he was eventually sentenced to 15 years in prison for a drug conspiracy conviction related to heroin. 2 years later, the Jet reported in its crime section that Mr. Johnson had begun his sentence after losing an appeal in the court earlier that year. Bumpy served the majority of that sentence at Alcatraz prison in San Francisco Bay, California as inmate 1117. And was released in 1963 on parole. Interestingly enough, Bumpy was still known on the inside as the Harlem Godfather, and was 8 years into his prison sentence in Alcatraz in June 11, 1962, when Frank Morris and Clarence and John Anglin made the only successful escape that had ever taken place from the institution. Some suspect that it was more than just a coincidence that Mr. Johnson was in the facility when the escape took place, and suspect that he, at the very least, has something to do with the infamous escape. There have been unconfirmed reports that allege that Bumpy had in fact used his mob connections to help secure a boat that would be waiting outside the prison to take them to San Francisco. His wife theorized that Mr. Johnson himself didn't escape alongside them because of his desire to be a free man rather than a fugitive, and free he now finally was, for a few years at least anyway. Bumpy Johnson now once again returned to Harlem following his release in 1963. Upon his arrival to Harlem, he noticed that he felt something was not right. While he may have still had the love and respect of the neighborhood and his local community, it was no longer the same place it was when he had left it. Bumpy was right. Harlem had changed a lot by that point. The neighborhood had largely fallen into despair as drugs had been flooded into the area, mostly thanks to the Mafia leaders with whom Mr. Johnson had once cooperated with in the years past. But it now seemed all previous friendships and negotiations had been forgotten, and it now fell on Mr. Johnson to make new deals and alliances to regain control of his Harlem neighborhood. Bumpy could not have been released at a better time. Harlem was on its knees, at the mercy of all the drugs being flooded into the area by the Mafia, with robberies, drugs, and prostitution at an all-time high. With hopes of rehabilitating the neighborhood and advocating for its black citizens, politicians and civil rights leaders began to draw as much attention as they could to the Harlem struggles. One leader was Bumpy Johnson's old friend, political activist Malcolm X. Malcolm X was a prominent civil rights leader and activist who advocated for the rights of African Americans in the United States. He rose to national prominence in the 1950s and 1960s as a member of the Nation of Islam, a black Muslim organization that emphasizes black pride and self-reliance. Malcolm X was known for his fiery speeches and his calls for black empowerment through the political action, economic independence and self-defense. Bumpy Johnson and Malcolm X had been friends since the 1940s, when Malcolm X was still a street hustler. Before becoming a prominent civil rights leader and activist, Malcolm X spent several years as a street hustler in Boston and New York City. Malcolm X's early life was marked by poverty, family instability, and his father's murder by white supremacists. After dropping out of school, Malcolm had moved to Boston and began hustling on the streets, engaging in petty crimes such as selling drugs, stealing and running numbers. Malcolm X's hustling activities brought him into contact with the criminal underworld, and he eventually became a member of a burglary ring. In 1946, he was arrested and convicted of burglary and sentenced to 10 years in prison. While in prison, Malcolm X underwent a transformation, becoming a devoted reader and student of the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X credited his time in prison with giving him an opportunity to educate himself and find a new sense of purpose. After his release from prison in 1952, Malcolm X became a prominent figure in the Nation of Islam and dedicated himself to advocating for the rights of African Americans. Spoke out against racial discrimination and segregation and called for black pride and self-reliance. Despite his early life as a street hustler, Malcolm X became a respected leader and a powerful voice for social justice. Now a powerful community leader, Malcolm X had asked Bumpy Johnson to provide him protection from his new enemies, the Nation of Islam. In 1964, Malcolm X had split from the Nation of Islam, the black Muslim organization he had been a member of since the 1950s. The split was the result of an ideological and personal differences between Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam's leadership, particularly Elijah Muhammad, the organization's founder and leader. Malcolm X's split from the Nation of Islam was a significant turning point in his life and career. He had become increasingly disillusioned with the organization's rigid teachings and authoritarian structure, and he had also come to believe that Elijah Muhammad was involved in immoral and unethical behavior. After leaving the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X founded his own organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and later the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He also shifted his political and philosophical views, moving away from the Nation of Islam's separatist beliefs and embracing a more inclusive and internationalist approach. Malcolm X's split from the Nation of Islam was controversial and led to tensions and conflict within the African American community. However, it allowed Malcolm X to develop his own voice and vision for a future of African Americans, and it paved the way for his continued activism and advocacy for social justice. But as Malcolm X grew in fame and gained confidence in the people, he soon decided that he shouldn't be associating with a known criminal like Bumpy Johnson, and had him ask his guards to stand down from protecting him. Just weeks later, Malcolm X was assassinated in Harlem. Little did Mr. Johnson know, but his time was also running short. However, when Bumpy Johnson died, his demise would prove to be far less brutal than Malcolm X's death. 5 years after being released from Alcatraz, the infamous prison, Bumpy Johnson died of a heart attack during the early hours of July 7th, 1968. Mr. Johnson was under a federal indictment for a drug conspiracy when he had died of a congestive heart failure on July 7th, 1968 at the age of 62. Bumpy was at Wells Restaurant in Harlem shortly before 2 a.m. and the waitress had just served him coffee, a chicken leg and Hormedy grits when he fell over clutching his chest. He lay in the arms of one of his closest friends, Junie Bird, as he breathed his last breath. Some were shocked by the suddenness of how Bumpy died, while others were simply surprised that it had not been a violent demise. As for Mamie, she reflected on the way Bumpy Johnson died as such. Bumpy's life may have been a violent and turbulent one, but his death was one that any Harlem sporting man would pray for. Eating fried chicken at Wells Restaurant in the wee hours of the morning, surrounded by your childhood friends. It just can't get any better than that. Thousands of people attended Mr. Johnson's funeral, including dozens of uniformed police officers who were stationed on the surrounding rooftops, shotgun in hand. They must have thought that Bumpy was going to get up from the casket and start raising hell, Mamie wrote. He is buried in Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, New York City. In the years after Bumpy Johnson had died, he remained an iconic figure especially in the Harlem criminal history. But despite his massive influence and power, until recently, Bumpy Johnson has largely stayed out of the national public consciousness in a way that other infamous gangsters have not. So the real question is, why is that? Some people believe that Mr. Johnson has been brushed off because he had too much power and influence as a black man ruling an entire neighborhood in New York City during the mid-20th century. The danger of this was, if Bumpy Johnson's name became infamous, this might have encouraged other black criminals to rise up in their own areas and oppose the Mafia who were controlling their neighborhood. However, in recent decades, Mr. Johnson's story has started to reach more people thanks to various films and television series. Lawrence Fishburne had played a Mr. Johnson-inspired character at the Cotton Club, which was directed by Francis Ford Coppola. He also portrayed Bumpy Johnson himself in Hoodlum, a goofy, historically set biopic in which the male lead delivered an even more inert performance, according to writer Joe Kunin. Most famous, perhaps, is the crime boss's portrayal in American Gangster, a film that Mamie Johnson has refused to see herself. According to her, Denzel Washington's depiction of Frank Lucas was more fiction than fact. Mr. Lucas was not Mr. Johnson's driver for more than a decade, and he was not present when Bumpy Johnson died. Mr. Lucas and Mr. Johnson actually had a falling out before he was sent to Alcatraz. As Mamie wrote, that's why we need more black people writing books to tell the real history. More recently, in 2019, Chris Brancato and Paul Eckstein created a series for Epic called The Godfather of Harlem, which tells the story of the crime boss, played by Forrest Whitaker, after he returned to Harlem from Alcatraz and lived out his final years in the neighborhood that he once ruled. Though Mr. Johnson's story may have been cast aside by some in the years after his death, it is clear that he will never be completely forgotten, especially in the Harlem criminal underworld. Mr. Johnson was arrested more than 40 times during his criminal career and served 2 prison terms for narcotic-related charges. In December 1965, Mr. Johnson staged a sit-down strike in the police station, refusing to leave as a protest against their continued surveillance. He was charged with refusal to leave a police station, but was acquitted by a judge. Bumpy Johnson married Mamie Hatcher in October 1948, just 6 months after their first meeting. Mr. Johnson had 2 daughters, Ruthie and Elise, the latter whom was born from another relationship. His wife died in 2009 at the age of 94. The most shocking thing about Harlem gangster Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson is that he died like a schnook. Lauded as the Godfather of Harlem, he was a golden age, a cat with 9 lives. He sidestepped some dozen shootings, as if bids for death were drops of rain. A pimp, a drug lord, numbers racketeer, a peddler of protection. Mr. Johnson travelled with a straight razor and had no aversion to using it. He slashed those who crossed him, and it is said that he destroyed a guy's eyeball with a spoon. Yet, when it was his time to go in 1968, he died of a heart attack. Mr. Johnson was eating breakfast of fried chicken and eggs at Wells restaurant in Harlem when cholesterol accomplished what his adversaries could not. That he lived 62 years without quitting his life of crime. He was out on a $50,000 bail stemming from a narcotics charge as he ate his last meal, and this speaks volumes of his wits and resiliency. Guys who survived the crime scene of Harlem were special, powerful, strong-willed people. Paul Eckstein, the co-creator and co-writer of Godfather of Harlem, the Johnson bioseries starring Forrest Whitaker, had said to be one of Harlem's best chess players. He fought strategically and often predicted what the Mafia would do. Mr. Johnson and the syndicate often tangled before they did it. What made him stand out in a neighborhood full of toughs is that he backed down to no one. Bumpy would be the first black guy to stand up to the white criminals, said Chris Brancato, Dean's partner on the series. And for that, the citizens of Harlem loved him and feared him. Born in Charleston, South Carolina in 1905, Bumpy was sent by his banker father to Harlem in 1919 with a hope that he would have a better life there. According to Mr. Brancato, there was a fear that his inability to be subservient would eventually get him lynched. But the life envisioned by Mr. Johnson's father was not to be. By age 15, Mr. Johnson was already a prolific second-story man. 1 year later, Mr. Johnson and a ragtag gang were committing armed robberies, extorting and selling protection. By his 17th birthday, Bumpy was doing time at Elmira Reformatory. He spent his 20s in and out of jail, establishing himself as a ruthless criminal, squaring off against an enforcer by the name of Ulysses Rollins. Bumpy slashed the man 36 times, but it was not until 1932, after 2.5 years in Sing Sing, on a grand larceny conviction, that Johnson would earn his Godfather of Harlem name. He capitalised off the fact that the numbers game was a big business in the 30s. It was essentially an illegal lottery in which thousands of locals bet from a nickel to $1 on a 3-digit number from 000 to 999. It was such a major moneymaker that the Bronx mobster Dutch Schultz wanted his piece of the £50 million per year industry. Get it? He ran roughshod over the number bosses of Harlem, giving them the option of working for him or losing their business altogether. Most accepted the former and took the $200 per week salaries, forsaking the thousands they earned on their own. One who refused the buckle was Madame Stephanie St. Clair, the only female numbers runner in Harlem. The femme fatale from Martinique, she enlisted a freshly sprung Bumpy to provide protection and keep Mr. Schultz away from her coffers. Even as Mr. Schultz's gunmen shot up her spots, Bumpy harnessed firepower of his own and operated strategically. Bumpy kept the war in Harlem, said Karen E. Quinnes Miller, who co-wrote the book Godfather of Harlem, which is of no relation to the series, with Bumpy's wife of over 20 years, Mamie Johnson. Because white men of Harlem were easily identified, he was able to go after Dutch's gang. Bumpy's men, on the other hand, blended in and could have been anywhere. The war lasted nearly 3 years. By the time Mr. Schultz got rubbed out in 1935, he was shot in the men's room of a Newark, New Jersey chop house by made men who caught wind he was plotting to kill a Fed and feared the blowback. Bumpy was now thriving in Harlem. In a torrid love affair with the sultry Vanity Fair editor Helen Lawrenson, the almond-eyed 5'7" Bumpy looked every part the crime boss. At her direction, he had suits custom made whilst purchasing shirts and ties from an elite haberdasher, Sulka. In her book, Stranger at the Party, Miss Lawrenson writes about the time he left a steak dinner for a shootout on the street. She sat nervously whilst hearing gunshots. 2 minutes later, Bumpy returned and Miss Lawrenson, a nervous wreck, asked what had happened. "Nothing," replied Bumpy. "We both missed. Now I'm gonna have to have a banana split. How about you?" He controlled much of Harlem and maintained a strong relationship with the mob kingpin, Charles Lucky Luciano. My grandfather and Lucky had respect for each other. Raymond Anthony Hatcher Johnson, a musician and Bumpy's great-grandson. They played chess together in public, outside the old YMCA on 135th Street. Bumpy's goddaughter, Verna Williams, said that she remembered seeing him mulling over a chessboard before looking up to tell her, "If you master the game of chess, you'll master the game of life." While Bumpy curried favour from the community, he is said to have paid rent for the down and out, bought school clothes for financially struggling children, including Arthur Miller, who grew up in Harlem, and put them through college, as he did for Eckstein's grandmother. Miller recounted a shootout on Lenox Avenue in which Bumpy chased the other guy as he drove away. Bumpy's car got disabled, so he jumped out and ran in the street, shooting his gun as he went. Another time, during an altercation with a pimp named New York Charlie, he tried to gorilla one of the prostitutes under Bumpy's protection, said Miller. Bumpy sliced him up with his straight razor. After the incident, Mr. Johnson took his victim to the hospital emergency room, where Charlie was put on a stretcher. He said, "That's the guy who did it," said Miller. Bumpy jumped on the gurney and started punching New York Charlie in the face. The police came, knocked Bumpy out, and arrested him. By the time Bumpy went to trial for the hospital assault and the stabbing, Charlie said he had no idea what the police were talking about. It's not for nothing that the assistant US attorney described Bumpy as the most vicious and dangerous criminal in Harlem. Bumpy Johnson's final stint in jail was a 10-year stretch for conspiracy and sale of narcotics, which eventually landed him in Alcatraz. He got out in 1963 at age 56. That was when his goddaughter, Verna, saw him for the first time. Everybody loved Uncle Bumpy, unless you did something to him. Then he went crazy on you. He could beat you up and beat you down. My mother said that he should have been a boxer. On the streets of Harlem, Bumpy came home to a world where the Italian mob had cut him out of his illegal enterprises. In a canny move, he aligned himself with Malcolm X and muscled back his power base, which included an extermination company called Palmetto Chemical. This was likely a front, even though he had legitimate customers, said Mr. Epstein. I heard from one of his guys that he distributed heroin in the spray containers Friends and relatives maintain that Bumpy profited from the sales of heroin in Harlem, but that he personally did not handle the drugs. Before dying, he and the NYPD had their final run-in. It ended with the French Connection, worthy car chase that began in his Harlem apartment and ended on the Van Wyck Expressway in Queens. Police charged him with conspiracy to distribute narcotics and believed he was poised to catch a flight to the Caribbean. No drugs were found and Bumpy was cut loose on a $50,000 bail. He died before the case went to trial. A very complex man, Mr. Johnson leaves behind a very mixed legacy. He wasn't Robin Hood, Mr. Eckstein said. He lived off the poor, robbed from other gangsters, and helped where he could. But after him, the idea of Harlem criminals thinking that they had at least some responsibility to the community, well, it got lost. In the 1971 film Shaft, Moses Gunn portrays Bumpy Jonas, a character based upon Mr. Johnson. In 1972, film Come Back Charleston Blue, the title character is loosely based on Bumpy Johnson, a criminal who is looked upon as a positive role model among the people. In 1979, the film Escape Alcatraz, Paul Benjamin plays a character based on Bumpy Johnson. In 1984, the film The Cotton Club, Lawrence Fishburne plays the character based on Bumpy Johnson, called Bumpy Roads. In 1997, the film Hoodlum showed Mr. Johnson again being played by Lawrence Fishburne. In 1999, the film Life by musician Rick James plays a Harlem gangster, Spanky Johnson, who was loosely inspired by Bumpy Johnson. In 2007, in the film American Gangster, Mr. Johnson is portrayed by Clarence William III. In an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, it is reported that Mr. Johnson allegedly helped the 3 escapees of Alcatraz get to the shores of San Francisco. It is said that he arranged for a boat to pick up the 3 men out of the bay. The boat then dropped the escapees off at Pier 13 in San Francisco's Hunters Point district. In the second episode of the 3rd season of HBO's The Wire, All Due Respect, Bumpy is mentioned just before Tree, the dealer for Cheese Wagstar, kills Jelly over a dogfight in which Cheese's dog lost. 3 low-level gangsters discussed an incident when Bumpy allegedly attacked police station single-handedly. This is expanded upon in Richard Price's audio commentary for that episode. The cable network Epic premiered the crime drama television series Godfather of Harlem in the fall of 2019. Forrest Whitaker plays Mr. Johnson. The series was created by executive producer Macun Smith, Chris Bracanto, and Paul Eckstein, who are producing with the ABC Signature Studios. Prodigy titled his first full release following being released from prison in 2011, the Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson EP, which was followed by the Bumpy Johnson album. Thank you for joining us today. What are your opinions on the late Bumpy Johnson? Do you believe that he was good for the community or that he caused more harm than good? Please let us know what you think in the comments below. Thank you for joining us today. If you enjoyed this content, please don't forget to like and share. And if you're new to the channel and want to see more Street Crime USA content, hit subscribe and press that bell so you can join us on the next video. Thank you for joining us, and until next time, stay safe.